Below you, something that makes no sense. An island, smaller than New York City. No oil, no minerals, no agricultural land worth mentioning. No river system, no natural resources of any kind. A tropical island at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula, sitting 1 degree north of the equator, so hot and humid that the British colonists who arrived here in 1819 considered it a hardship posting. In 1965, this island was forcibly expelled from Malaysia. Not invaded, not conquered. Expelled. Kicked out. The Prime Minister of the newly independent Singapore, a 42-year-old lawyer named Lee Kuan Yew, stood in front of cameras and wept on live television because he knew what everyone else knew. This place had no chance. 5 million people today, the third highest per capita income in the world, the busiest port on Earth, the most connected airport in Asia, a city so clean, so efficient, so ruthlessly well organized that the rest of the world has spent 60 years trying to figure out how it works. Welcome to seat 32A. We're landing in Singapore. And the story of this city is the story of the most unlikely success in the history of human civilization. Look down at the shape of it first. Singapore is diamond-shaped. 60 kilometers from east to west, 23 kilometers from north to south. 730 square kilometers total, about the size of Chicago, minus the hinterland, minus the suburbs, minus the surrounding farmland. Just the island. And around it, about 60 smaller islands. You can see some of them from this altitude, small green dots in the strait between Singapore and Indonesia to the south. The water surrounding Singapore is not decorative. It is the reason Singapore exists. The Singapore Strait, that narrow channel between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, is one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Approximately 1/4 of all global trade passes through it. Container ships, supertankers, bulk carriers, the continuous maritime traffic that connects the manufacturing economies of East Asia to the consumer markets of Europe and America. All of it passes through this strait. All of it can be seen from the southern shores of this island. Whoever controls this strait controls 1/4 of the world's trade. The British understood this in 1819 when Stamford Raffles, an agent of the British East India Company, arrived on the island and negotiated a treaty with the local Malay Sultan to establish a trading post. Raffles was not primarily interested in Singapore itself. He was interested in the strait. The island was the price of admission. What Raffles found on the island was not nothing. There was a Malay fishing village, a few hundred people, some royal politics that he skillfully exploited. But there was no city, no port, no infrastructure. Just jungle, mangrove swamps, tigers, yes, tigers, wild Sumatran tigers that crossed the causeway from the Malay Peninsula and killed people in Singapore into the 1930s. And a strategic location that Raffles correctly identified as the most valuable real estate in Southeast Asia. Within 5 years of Raffles' arrival, Singapore had 10,000 inhabitants. Within 20 years, it was one of the busiest ports in Asia. The British had created, almost by accident, a city. Now let's talk about the city that grew up under British rule, because colonial Singapore is a story that most people don't know, and it is essential to understanding what came later. The British built Singapore as a free port, no tariffs, no import duties, no restrictions on trade. This was radical for the time. Most ports charged significant duties that generated revenue for the colonial power. Raffles' bet was different. Make the port free and the trade will come. The trade came. What also came were people. The British needed labor to build the port, to work the warehouses, to crew the ships, to run the shops and the banks and the opium trade, and yes, the opium trade, which was a significant and deliberate part of Singapore's early colonial economy. Chinese workers came from southern China, primarily from Fujian and Guangdong provinces. Tamil workers came from southern India. Malay workers came from the peninsula. Arab traders came from Yemen and Hadramaut. Jewish merchants came from Baghdad. Armenians came from Persia. By 1900, Singapore was one of the most genuinely cosmopolitan cities in Asia, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the free port attracted everyone who needed a port. The British managed this diversity through a system of ethnic segregation that Lee Kuan Yew would later both inherit and transform. Different races lived in different quarters. The Chinese in Chinatown, the Indians in Little India, the Malays in Kampong Glam, the Europeans in their colonial bungalows on the hills above it all. The city worked. The city was prosperous. But it was a city of parallel communities that barely mixed. And then the Japanese came. February 15, 1942, the British garrison at Singapore surrenders to Japanese forces. 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops lay down their arms, the largest surrender in British military history. Winston Churchill calls it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The fall of Singapore in 70 days of fighting takes place despite the fact that the British had built one of the most heavily fortified naval bases in the world on the island's northern shore. The guns were facing south toward the sea because the British military strategists had concluded that any attack on Singapore would come by sea. The Japanese came from the north, through the jungle, on bicycles. This is not a minor detail. The British myth of invincibility, the idea that the empire was too powerful, too sophisticated, too organized to be defeated by Asians, collapsed in 70 days because a Japanese general looked at a map, saw that the British had fortified the sea approach, and simply came the other way. For the people of Singapore, this was a revelation, and for one 20-year-old Peranakan Chinese student watching the British surrender, it was the defining moment of his life. Lee Kuan Yew would later write that the fall of Singapore taught him one thing above all others. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. And he decided in that moment that Singapore would never again be weak. The Japanese occupation lasted 3.5 years. It was brutal. The Japanese military conducted systematic massacres of the Chinese population, an operation called Suk Ching, meaning purge through cleansing, in which an estimated 25,000 to 50,000 Chinese men were killed, selected for execution because they were considered potential resistance fighters or supporters of China in the Sino-Japanese War. The exact number of dead is still disputed between Singapore and Japan. When the British returned in 1945, they found a city that had been fundamentally changed. The colonial myth was gone. The people of Singapore had seen their colonizers defeated and humiliated. They were not going back to being subjects. Now look at the skyline from this altitude. What you're seeing is not a natural evolution. It is a planned city in a way that almost no other city on Earth is. Every building you can see has been placed there by a government that, since 1959, has exercised a level of control over its urban environment that would be impossible in a democracy that prioritized individual property rights above collective planning. This is the paradox at the heart of Singapore. It is a democracy. Elections are held, the People's Action Party wins them, but it is a democracy in which one party has governed continuously since independence, in which political opposition has been systematically marginalized through defamation lawsuits and electoral district manipulation, and the simple fact that the government has delivered results so extraordinary that most Singaporeans have not felt the need to vote differently. Lee Kuan Yew called it Asian values democracy. His critics called it soft authoritarianism. Both descriptions are accurate, which is exactly the problem with trying to understand Singapore from the outside. Here is what Lee's government did between 1965 and 1990. It took a city of slums and built public housing for 90% of the population. Not the grim concrete blocks of Soviet public housing, actual apartments in planned towns with schools and parks and shopping centers and MRT stations that Singaporeans own. 81% of HDB flat residents own their homes, a home ownership rate higher than almost any country on Earth. It built a world-class education system from scratch in 3 languages simultaneously that today produces students who consistently rank first or second in the world in mathematics and science. It eliminated corruption so thoroughly that Singapore ranks among the least corrupt countries on Earth, while its neighbors, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, struggle with public corruption as a fact of daily life. It built an economy that in 1965 had a GDP per capita of roughly $500 and today has a GDP per capita of $80,000. Higher than the United States, higher than Germany, higher than Japan. How? The answer is both simple and profoundly uncomfortable for people who believe in free markets and individual liberty as the foundation of prosperity. Singapore did it through control, through the deliberate, systematic, unapologetic exercise of state power over almost every aspect of economic and social life. The Central Provident Fund, the mandatory savings scheme that requires Singaporeans to contribute a significant portion of their income to a government-managed account that can only be used for housing, healthcare, and retirement, is simultaneously one of the most effective social security systems ever designed and one of the most coercive. You don't choose to save. You are required to save. The government holds your money and tells you what you can spend it on. Gum is banned. Jaywalking is fined. Spitting is fined. Littering is fined. Graffiti can result in caning. The state reaches into corners of daily life that most countries would consider private. And the country is immaculate. The public housing is excellent. The schools work. The hospitals work. The trains run. The corruption is minimal. The air is clean, or as clean as equatorial air can be when you've planted 7 million trees across an island barely larger than Chicago. Lee Kuan Yew, when asked about the restrictions on civil liberties that his government imposed, gave answers that were intellectually consistent, if politically uncomfortable. He did not believe that liberal democracy was universally applicable. He believed that different societies required different governance models. and that the priority for a newly independent, resource-poor multi-ethnic island state was order and economic growth, not freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. He was, in the deepest sense, a technocrat. He believed that if you optimized the inputs, education, infrastructure, corruption control, rule of law, foreign investment policy, the outputs would follow. He was right. The outputs followed. Now look at the water south of the island. Those small green islands scattered in the Singapore Strait. Sentosa, the closest large island, connected to the mainland by a causeway and a cable car, is Singapore's pleasure island. It was, until the 1970s, a British military base and then a Malay fishing village. The government renamed it Sentosa, which means peace and tranquility in Malay, and built it into one of the most visited resort destinations in Asia. Universal Studios, beach resorts, a casino, a luxury residential enclave where houses sell for $50 million. It was also, in 2018, the location of one of the most surreal diplomatic events of the modern era, the Singapore summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. The first meeting between sitting leaders of the United States and North Korea took place at the Capella Hotel on Sentosa Island. Two leaders of nuclear powers negotiating in a Singaporean resort built on a former military base renamed Peace and Tranquility. Singapore has a sense of humor about these things. Or perhaps it simply understands that hosting the world's most important conversations requires the right infrastructure. Further south, the Sisters Islands, two small islets designated as a marine park, one of the few places in Singapore where coral reefs still survive. The marine biodiversity of the strait has been severely degraded by decades of land reclamation and shipping traffic, but small pockets remain. Singapore has added approximately 25% to its land area through reclamation since independence, literally creating new land by dumping sand into the sea, buying the sand from neighboring countries until those countries started refusing to sell it because they were running out of their own coastlines. The island is growing. Physically, it is getting larger every year because the government decides it needs to be larger. Look at Marina Bay from this altitude. That curved waterfront, the glittering towers, the 3 buildings joined by the sky deck, the illuminated dome of the Art Science Museum, the gardens by the bay with its super trees visible even from here. This is the most deliberate piece of urban design in the world. Not a square centimeter of it happened by accident. Marina Bay was built on reclaimed land. The entire downtown waterfront extension, 360 hectares, is new land, created from nothing, planned from scratch, built according to a master plan that specified not just what would be built, but how the buildings would relate to each other, what the sight lines would be, how the pedestrian flows would work. The Marina Bay Sands. Those 3 towers joined by the Sky Park at the top, with the infinity pool visible from the air, cost 8 billion Singapore dollars to build and opened in 2010. It was designed by Israeli-Canadian architect Moshe Safdie, who wanted to avoid building a wall between the city and the sea, and instead created a structure that opened toward the water at the base while connecting across the sky at the top. It is one of the most photographed buildings in the world. It is also, like everything in Singapore, the product of a specific government decision. The decision to legalize casinos in 2005, despite Lee Kuan Yew's long opposition, because the government calculated that an integrated resort with a casino would generate more tourism revenue than the island was generating without one. The calculation was correct. Tourism revenue increased dramatically after Marina Bay Sands opened. Everything in Singapore is a calculation, and the calculations keep being correct. But here is what the calculations don't fully capture. Walk into a hawker center on any weekday at noon. A hawker center is Singapore's democratic institution. It is a government-built food court, open air, under a roof, with dozens of individual stalls, where you can eat a bowl of laksa or a plate of chicken rice or a roti prata for $2. The same meal in a restaurant would cost $15. The hawker center is where the office worker and the construction worker and the retired grandmother and the tourist all sit at the same plastic tables and eat the same food. Singapore has 114 hawker centers. The government built them deliberately in the 1970s to replace the street hawkers, the itinerant food vendors who had been part of Singapore's food culture for a century, by giving them permanent, regulated, hygienically managed stalls. The hawker culture is now a UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. A Michelin-starred hawker stall sells chicken rice for $3 and has a 2-hour queue. The food of Singapore is not one food. It is the food of every community that has ever lived here. Chinese, Malay, Indian, Peranakan, all of it coexisting in one hawker center at one table in one city. You can have a Hainanese chicken rice next to a banana leaf curry, next to a laksa, next to a mee siam, chosen by whoever is sitting at your table, regardless of race or religion, all for under $10. This is what Lee Kuan Yew called multiracialism, not the multicultural model of allowing different communities to coexist separately, the Singaporean model of requiring them to live together in the same public housing blocks, in the same schools, at the same hawker tables. The HDB racial quota system ensures that no public housing block becomes ethnically segregated. Chinese families must live next to Malay families, must live next to Indian families, not by choice, by policy. It is coercive. It has also produced a society where the ethnic riots that have periodically convulsed Malaysia and Indonesia have not occurred in Singapore since 1969. Now let's talk about what Singapore costs. Singapore is the most expensive city in the world to own a car, not to drive, to own. Before you can register a car, you must purchase a certificate of entitlement, a government permit that gives you the right to own a vehicle for 10 years. The price of this certificate fluctuates at auction. It has exceeded 100,000 Singapore dollars for the permit alone before you buy the car. This is not an accident. It is a deliberate policy to control the number of vehicles on the road because the island is too small to accommodate unlimited car ownership without gridlock. It works. Singapore's roads are not gridlocked. The MRT works. The buses run on time. Everything costs something here. The freedom not to wear a seatbelt costs a fine. The freedom to chew gum costs, well, gum is simply not for sale. The freedom to import a car without paying an enormous premium does not exist. The freedom to own a house in certain areas is restricted by racial quotas. The freedom to criticize the government in ways that can be construed as defamatory comes with the credible risk of a lawsuit from the Prime Minister's office. And yet, Singapore's Human Development Index score is among the highest in the world. Life expectancy is 84 years, higher than Japan, higher than Switzerland. The infant mortality rate is among the lowest on Earth. The public schools are among the best in the world. The hospitals are extraordinary. The streets are safe. What is Singapore trading for all of this?
That is the question that Singapore's young people,
born into the prosperity that Lee Kuan Yew built, educated in the excellent schools he designed, living in the public housing his government constructed, are increasingly asking out loud. The cost of living is extraordinarily high. Housing is unaffordable for many young Singaporeans despite the public housing system. The pressure of academic achievement from childhood is relentless. Singapore's schools are the best in the world, partly because Singaporean children study harder and longer than children almost anywhere else. The anxiety is real. The burnout is real. The question of whether the Singapore model, prosperity purchased through control, is sustainable as the generation that remembers what Singapore was like before refuses to give way to the generation that only knows what it is like now. We are close now. Watch the window. As we descend toward Changi Airport, consistently rated the best airport in the world, the airport that contains a waterfall, a butterfly garden, a cinema, a rooftop pool, and a 10-story shopping mall that has been voted best airport so many times that it has essentially retired the category, look at the city below. Look at the public housing blocks rising in every direction. Those identical towers that house 90% of the population, planned and built by a government that decided housing was too important to leave to the market. Look at the green, the extraordinary amount of green for a city this size, the trees planted along every highway, the parks threaded through every neighborhood, the rooftop gardens and the vertical greenery on the building facades, the city in a garden that Singapore has been building since the 1960s. Look at the port on the western side of the island, the second busiest port in the world by tonnage, the port that handles more than a quarter of the world's container transshipment, the port that is the actual engine of Singapore's economy beneath the gleaming towers of the financial district. And look at the strait, the water that Raffles saw in 1819 and understood was worth more than the island itself. Singapore is the proof of one extraordinary idea, that with enough will, enough intelligence, and enough willingness to make uncomfortable choices, a people can build something from nothing. Literally from nothing. No oil, no minerals, no river, no agricultural land, no natural resources except the location and the people. Just the location and the people. And 60 years of decisions, some brilliant, some brutal, some both simultaneously, that turned a fishing village at the edge of a jungle into the most improbably successful city on earth. From up here, looking down at the towers and the hawker centers and the green and the port and the strait, it looks like a miracle. It is not a miracle. It is a policy. This was Seat 32A, Singapore, Episode 7, the city that had no chance and became the most improbable success story of the 20th century. The island that was expelled from its own country and responded by becoming richer than the country that expelled it. The democracy that governs like a corporation, and the corporation that performs like a democracy. The city where gum is banned and the airport has a butterfly garden, and the hawker center serves Michelin-starred chicken rice for $3. The city that asked one question over and over again for 60 years. What works? And kept answering it. Next time, we go somewhere completely different. Same seat, different window, same question. What is this city really? Subscribe and find a window seat.